So I'm just going to hand over to Emma, who's going to take us through what we're going to cover today.
Thanks, Virginia. Kia ora koutou. My name is Emma, and I'm one of the experience design leads here at Springload. As Virginia mentioned, today we're going to be taking a glance at what the Plain Language Act looks like in action before diving into a bit more nuanced detail of the Act, which has been in effect for just over a month now, I believe. From there, we'll talk about what our government clients should be doing to ensure that they are compliant with the Act, and also, I guess, just what anybody who believes in the spirit of the Act can be doing, which is essentially how do you make sure your communications are accessible and inclusive to all your audiences. Our focus today here is on web page content, as that's our area of expertise here at Springload. However, it's worth keeping in mind that the Act covers a wider range of communication, and that is things such as brochures or flyers and forms, so anything that's kind of in the digital and non-digital communication content space. At Springload, we're all really passionate advocates for accessibility, inclusion, and plain language, and that's the reason we're running this webinar today. We work with a wide range of organisations who are going to be impacted by this Act, and those who are just curious about how to implement plain language. And we'd just like to note that although while we have experience working in and with the public sector, this is not official guidance. We hope you'll leave here today, though, with some awareness and familiarity with what the Act means in practice, and also with some steps that you can action towards taking a plain language approach in your online products.
Thanks so much, Emma. So as we get started, I think let's just take a few moments to consider what the phrase plain language means to us. So what does plain language mean to you? And some of you may already be very much the plain language champions in your organisation, because this is by no means a new thing. Others of you may be very new to this idea or this way of thinking. So what is plain language? Here's a definition of plain language. And one of the things that we really like about this definition here at Springload is the way that it highlights how plain language is not just about using plain or simple words to convey a message or a piece of information. That obviously, you know, this is a huge part of it. And I'm sure a lot of you, when we were thinking about plain language, thought of, you know, not using jargon or not using government speak or, you know, that sort of technical language when thinking about the meaning of plain language. But what this definition highlights is that plain language principles also come into play through considering how that communication is structured and designed, which can go beyond writing and into that more interdisciplinary space of user experience and content design. So we wanted to take some time just at the beginning of this presentation to go through you know, what we mean by that, and a little bit of plain language training, I guess. So this is an example of a web page on Massey University's website from a time when we worked with them to rewrite their whole website in plain language. And if we were to follow a checklist for plain language, and there are quite a few resources out there on the web already and in the government space, so the Ministry of Social Development, for example, has a checklist that you can follow to see whether you're following plain language. We'd be giving it a tick for some of the plain language principles, like being very clear about who the audience is. So in this case, the audience is farmers. On this page, you can see that we're using everyday language that our readers are familiar with. So an example of that is down at the bottom of that first image, what we do, for example. We're also speaking to the audience very directly, using words like you and we. So imagining that we're in a conversation with the audience and being very straightforward in that conversation. For example, please call us to discuss your needs. We're trying to be as concise as we possibly can, using clear, short sentences and paragraphs with just one idea in each of them. And similarly, where we can, we're using short words on this page: meet the team, We're also, as we touched on, avoiding jargon, acronyms, and technical words, while also in this particular case, bearing in mind that we are speaking to a specialist audience of farmers, not the general public. And we're also not assuming that users have read other content on the website before landing on this page in order to understand what we're talking about. So each page or each communication has meaning in and of itself without relying on prior context. And while doing this, which is a lot, working through those principles, we're also trying to not lose the opportunity to use a really warm and helpful tone, trying to be human and polite rather than very stern and authoritarian. And those are some of the writerly aspects, I guess, of plain language tenets. But in addition to those more wordsmithy things, the structure and design of this page also supports plain language principles. So this is really Emma's area of expertise, and she's going to take us through some of those elements on this page.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia, and thanks for the introduction to what plain language can look like. And as you can see, plain language manifests in this design through multiple ways. So the first thing you might notice is we have a short, concise heading and a summary at the top of the page, which really helps orient the user. The design constrains the line length, which optimizes readability. Plain language comes through in the navigation design and what we call the micro copy of the page. And so that's the small design details like navigation labels and headings. Plain language helps us create an inverted pyramid content style. And what that means is we start with the most important information at the hero, right at the top, rather than burying it in the conclusion deep down in the page. Plain language allows us to lean on navigation elements such as jump links, which you find at the top of the page, and navigation at the side to help readers easily scan the page to find what they need. We're using concise subheadings and really limiting the heading levels to again aid scannability. And we design those headings and other elements in a way that are logical, clear, and quite legible. You also notice the use of bulleted lists here, which also help our users to scan for information so they can complete their action or goal.
So this is the same information before those plain language principles were applied by the team at Massey and at Springlode. And you can see that this just feels harder, harder to engage with. The words and the sentences and the paragraphs are a lot longer. Some of those design aspects haven't been accommodated to, even if they were short sentences, they're still stretching very much across the page. It's really difficult on this page to get the information that you need quickly. There aren't a lot of hooks for your eye. So the page hasn't been chunked, for example, into subsections with subheadings. And then I think also the design and the user experience aren't supporting the ease of access to the information. And as we discovered through the process of really thinking about the audience on this page, what these farmers really want to know is how to contact the clinic in an emergency. Often they're stressed, they're in a situation of anxiety. On this page, to get to that information, it's not top of the page, it's a little bit further down, albeit it's in bold and caps. Whereas you can see after we've painted that plain language approach across the page, that contact information and that information they need right up front is there top in the page hierarchy. So designing web content as plain language means that your intended reader can read something once, understand it, and then act on that information. They don't have to spend a lot of time sort of digesting and trying to get through the nuance of the copy to work out where the information that they might need is located. And they don't have to reread to make sure they've got it right. So to summarize, we like to say that we're meeting the principles of plain language when copy, content, and design are coming together to meet the needs of a defined and understood user. So as Emma mentioned, we now have an official act passed by Parliament that makes designing communications and writing in this way a legal requirement. By law, certain government communications should now use language that is clear, concise, and well organized. I just wanted to take a moment actually to recognise, though, that this isn't a new thing. We know that a lot of government agencies and a lot of organisations in general have been on this road for a really, really long time. So in many ways, what the Act is doing is really just recognising and validating the work that many communications specialists have been championing for decades. And I think, just to summarise, though, in plain language, what the Act is saying is that the Plain Language Act means government agencies must use clear wording, structure and design in communications to the general public, including websites. So I think Emma's going to talk a little bit about why we believe this is important. Why do we even need an Act?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, Virginia. And so the debate around passing the Plain Language Bill into legislation is actually a really interesting read. And if you've got the time or you're curious about it, I would recommend going online and reading it yourself. But basically, the idea was initially put forward by Chris Hipkins, as the United States had a similar legislation. And fundamentally, it's saying that the ability for everyone to easily understand and act on information that's put out by the government, regardless of their literacy level, regardless of their ability, is a basic democratic right. And if you think about that in terms of like a real world situation, if you imagine the team who put out the COVID-19 information during the pandemic, could it have been as effective as it was if the experts weren't great at plain language? Sorry, that was really weirdly phrased. Yeah, so like they were able to communicate in such a clear way due to the nature of the plain language that they used. Plain language also supports greater accessibility, especially for people with difficulties reading, if they've got low vision, or for speakers of languages other than English. Having plain language as an official act or law means it gives these basic human rights prominence and gravitas, and it's more likely that they're going to be taken seriously. What you might have picked up on is that the Plain Language Act also intersects with several of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. These criteria cover writing for the right reading level, omitting unusual words and jargon, identifying abbreviations, and having clear headings and labels. So in essence, if you are meeting the requirements of this Plain Language Act, you're also starting to meet your accessibility obligations as well. But in saying that, it's not just about obligations, and there are many other reasons to apply plain language principles. I'm just going to go through some of these today. The first one we've noted here is around cost savings. So the Act is significant in the way that it can actually save money, meaning the taxpayers' dollars can go into things that really matter, as opposed to being funneled into call center responses because the information on a website is unclear and people don't know what to do. It also is cheaper to convert plain language communications into alternative formats and then translate those into different languages. Having legislation around plain language also means that we can achieve a more integrated and consistent user experience across all the interactions and touch points that you have with your users and the public, as opposed to a patchy, inconsistent experience where someone might go to one government website to get information where it is very easy to digest and it's easy to understand and they can act on it, but then they'll go to another website where that information could be confusing or frustrating, and then that in turn, due to the language barrier, it kind of prevents any engagement or progression in that user's journey. And for many of us who write for government websites, it's also a support mechanism. The Act lets us say it's not just my personal preference to use language that is accessible to all, it's an act of compliance.
So we're going to go now a little bit into the specifics of the Act. So what the Act covers. Is it going to apply to everything for our government clients, or do you need to rewrite your whole website and the backlog of all of that content? So first, let's look at who is officially impacted by the Act. So as you can see here, the Act applies to public service agencies and Crown agents. But we also believe that, you know, anyone can use plain language and should, so anybody can start following these principles and support the spirit of the Act in their communications. So the Act doesn't apply for government organisations to all of your content. There are particular documents that must use plain language. And so the use of the word documents here is a little bit misleading. Obviously, this idea of, you know, PDF springs to mind, but they're not actually just talking about documents. Documents in the context of the Act refers to web pages or a website or a flyer or a brochure, as well as the more traditional documents that we might host on a website. And the specific content or documents which now must use plain language are communications that are for the public generally. So rather than something that's just directed at a very specific audience or a specific individual communication, for example, an email you're sending to a member of the public, the communications covered are those that are for the general public. Secondly, the law only covers or has in scope content that's in English language, but obviously that English language can contain Te Reo Māori. The other scope note is that it must be in a visible and a tangible format. So for example, in print or electronic, which can include forms or templates, as well as web pages. But it's not referring, for example, to telephone conversations with a member of the public. So not all communications are going to fall under this Act. And the Act gives official support for plain language communications and these kinds of content. So information about services that your agency provides, information about how to use the services. And this one's quite interesting. It also includes any content that's part of that, I guess, journey around engaging with the service. So that might be a form or it might be a document download. The Act also applies to content about giving information back to a government agent or a public service agency. It covers any explanations about how the public should comply with a government requirement, anything that impacts the public's rights or interests, and then content within public education initiatives. So that example that Emma raised of the COVID-19 public education content was a really good example for that one. So don't panic, it's not all of the content, because I think the Act very well recognises that retrospectively meeting the needs of the Plain Language Act across all of your content could be a massive task for some government departments. So a really pragmatic approach has been taken. So in terms of when it comes into effect and which content you should bring into view to apply the Act to, anything that has been launched or documents issued in the language of the Act on or after the 21st of April 2023 now must, if it's within the scope notes that we just talked about, comply with the Act. And then in terms of retrospective content, if you have old content that you choose to revise because it's still current or it still has relevancy for your audiences, the Plain Language Act is also going to come into effect on those revisions. And of note there is that even if you're just revising, you know, you're tweaking a sentence within that old web page, the whole page now needs to comply with the Act. There are a few other requirements just to note within the Act, trying to save you a little bit of your own reading time here. So the Act is actually very clever in the sense that it has safeguarded itself from a sustainability perspective. So it doesn't go very deeply into the operational details or how this should be implemented within government departments. It really does focus on the spirit and the intent of plain language. So it talks about, for example, that guidance is going to be given by the Commissioner on how to implement the Act. So that guidance sits outside the Act, meaning it's not going to need to be relitigated year after year and updated to align with latest practices on plain language. The Act also talks about how government departments within that scope are going to need to appoint plain language officers. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about practical actions you can take. You're also going to need to report on compliance with the Commissioner. Again, we'll pick this up a little bit later. Of note, the Act is not enforceable in a court of law. Should it be? I don't know, but so it's not I guess, a legally enforceable piece of legislation, but it is the right thing to do, we believe. And also noted in the Act is it doesn't impact other legislation such as the Māori Language Act or the New Zealand Sign Language Act. So what should government organisations or government clients or anybody who believes in the spirit of plain language be doing? We've grouped a little bit of advice into a number of areas. So I think attending a webinar like this and reading and talking about the Act is an amazing first step. So tick, this presentation gives you just that basic understanding of what the Act is, who it's for, what's impacted, what's covered, what's out of scope. And we would encourage you to share the word with others in your organisation to raise that awareness. If you want to go a little bit more deeply, you can read the Act yourself. And secondly, we recommend that you familiarise yourself with that official guidance I talked about earlier. So the Public Service Commission has set out 5 key steps for agencies and departments impacted to follow. You might already have these in place, but so those steps are, and you can access them at that URL below. Firstly, to appoint a plain language officer within your organisation to champion plain language and to encourage others to be adhering to the Plain Language Act. And the Act notes that your plain language officer, the Public Service Commission guidance recommends that that's within your organisation, which makes a lot of sense. The Act notes that they can also be from outside your agency if necessary. Secondly, starting to give training and resources to colleagues within your organisation, starting with this kind of webinar where you're really just understanding the Act and then levelling up into some of the principles that we were going through when we went through that Massey example. Step 3, having a process and a mechanism for taking on public feedback about plain language in your communications. That can be as simple as an email address that you've already got it set up, or you could take that a little further. Step 4, or number 4, starting to fold an expectation that we follow the Act into your internal processes if you don't already have this. So that's things like, just setting that expectation, having processes and workflow around, for example, peer review of communications or testing communications with the audience that they are intended to reach to check that they are actually landing as a piece of plain language. And then 5 is reporting on plain language activity each year. So those impacted by the Act will be approached by the Commissioner and will need to be reporting on how they have been adhering to the Act throughout the year. And so the third, I guess, action area that we have identified is around, recognising that if you need more support, you can get it from a number of places. So there is expertise within your organisation, and there are also specialists outside your organisation who can support you if you need it. So some of the activities that you could look into, maybe, just getting in a benchmark content review or audit across your impacted communications so that you can show progress over time. Similarly, you might want to do the same thing from a UX design perspective to cover off some of those aspects that Emma went through. just picking up on the Commissioner's guidance, just starting to do some training and coaching in the specifics of the plain language principles. So some of that checklist type material that we went through at the beginning of this webinar, and going deeper in that kind of training and writing coaching. There are also standards out there which can be a great motivator within your organisation to raise that bar. So if you're not familiar already with the Right Mark Plain Language Standard, I'd recommend checking that out. It effectively gives you a quality tick for your plain language communication. So it says, hey, we believe in this and we are meeting officially the plain language standard. And the other one I've noted there is the Plain Language Awards, which have been going for over a decade, I think, at least, can also be a really great motivator internally. You know, how great would it be to make a real change in your communications and then be able to demonstrate that you achieved that with an award?
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Virginia. Like, it's just so good to get that really clear list of actionable things that people can do and take away today. I thought I'll just give a little summary of what we've covered so far and then hand over to Claire to look at any questions that have come through in the chat. So yeah, in summary, we've covered what the principles of plain language are and shown some examples of what it looks like in practice. We've covered what the Act is and why it's important and what you are required to do if you would like to be compliant with it. Excuse me. And hopefully we've given you a few starters for beginning or continuing your plain language journey within your organization. Really, really stoked to have had you all here with us today. So let's take a look at the questions now. I just want to note, if we can't answer them, we will follow up with you at a later date when we are definitely able to. So Claire, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, you guys. You can hear me, eh?
We can hear you.
Yay. Okay, awesome. I've got some cool questions that have come through, and yeah, as these questions might inspire other questions. So you know, you guys, everyone listening in can just keep sending them through the chat function. So there's one question here about the farmers example, the Massey example, and I think one of you said the design constrains the line length. And the question is, did you do the design or the copy first? Or like, how did that process work?
That's a good question.
It is a great question.
It was Emma who talked about the line length, and she can probably talk about other projects with line length. I can talk about the Massey example specifically because I was deeply involved in that project. It's quite chicken and egg. So we tend to do wireframes before we do design, like formal designs that lay out pages, and we use real content inside those. So the wireframe process sort of drives some exemplar content, and then we brought the content into that wireframe. But then we wrote the official pages after that. So we had the design templates were happening in parallel with the writing process, and the writing was quite autonomous from the design template. Does that answer the question? I might need you, Emma, to jump in.
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in. So from a design point of view, what's best practice in our community, at least, is to not have more than 80 characters in a line. So there's lots of really great research out there in terms of like scannability of the page and the flow of information. And so we tend to work to between 70 to 90 characters. Kind of 80 characters is the sweet spot for having a really, really good line length. And so regardless of what that copy is, we will try and sit to that. But it's generally like a practice that we try and use across all the projects that we work on at Springload.
Yeah, but I think what I was trying to say is that the copy could have been poured into any container and was quite independent, while our designers were applying that expertise of constraining the line length.
Yeah, awesome.
Awesome, cool. Here's another question, which is, what's the most important information that should be in plain language, and how do you know what that is?
All of the information should be in plain language because it's all important. Is that, I wonder, in relation to the Act or just in general? My sense would be, regardless, getting a really strong understanding of your audiences and your users, and doing some of that user research up front is going to give you a real steer around what your readers are expecting as important content to prioritize. And so often in our projects, we'll do sort of a user journey mapping session or some upfront audience research, and then start mapping content in relation to that. And that can really help you prioritize. It's hard doing this without the actual questionnaire. Yeah, that would be my sense, is sort of understand the audience to drive where you apply the lens.
Can I add to that?
You can.
Something that we've done in the past as well is having had a section where it's like kind of like an extra for experts, or like an area where you've got like the simplified plain language version, but then sometimes you might need to communicate something in a bit more of a technical way. And so you would have like a dual response or a dual content approach there, where you've got that simplified plain description so that that's inclusive for everyone. And then if there's anything else that you need to include, or if someone is wanting a bit more additional information, like as long as it is kind of this and then that, like it's not like in you're not doing one or the other, like that can sometimes help solve that problem.
Yeah. I think the Act is also going to help you prioritize, just thinking about where you spend that attention, looking through those different kinds of information that it outlines. That's your musts. So definitely use that as must be first off in plain language. And then, as Emma says, you might look at other non-legislated content and think, where are we going to lift the bar with the rest of our content to also be in plain language, or to have alternate versions that are in plain language.
Awesome. I think that this other question, I think you guys have already kind of answered this, but it was, can you make plain language improvements to your website without having done audience research, or does it always need to come from audience research? I think I've sort of summarized that a little bit, but I think you guys have both already sort of answered that, but maybe you want to say a bit more?
Yes, you definitely can. You don't need to invest in audience research to write in a plain language way. I mean, you can go a long way just by starting to rework the content that you've got and looking at it. And as long as you're clear in your mind about who is this communication for? Like every time I pick up a piece of content, who am I directing this at? Who is my imagined reader? That's really the plain language approach. It's not that you have to understand that audience member. It's that you have to have in mind who that person is that you're speaking to. And you can do that based on assumptions, This is for the general public, which is very amorphous. So the imagined reader is anybody who could walk in off the street. That's where I start. And then I start applying my other principles, such as my breaking my page down into short subheadings, using shorter language, not using jargon, that kind of thing. And you can do that anytime. You just pick it up and start.
There's also quite a few really helpful tools out there as well. So if you don't have access to a wider content team to peer review, there's things like Grammarly. You can throw your content in there and set the reading age or like simplification, and that can just be a really good helpful tool to guide you in that journey.
100%. I didn't want to raise it, but also, sometimes I am a content designer. I do this for a living, but I'm still throwing content into ChatGPT occasionally just to get a sense of how could I make this even plainer, I think occasionally still throwing it in like it's around forever. But yeah, I'm starting to use that tool just to get a little bit of a bounce off someone.
That's awesome. I love that you just said off someone. ChatGPT. That's it. That's the questions that we have, unless anyone wants to send any more questions through. But also, I think you guys said at the beginning, didn't you, that any more questions we could answer through when we send out the slides and the recording, if anyone wanted to email a question to us.
Yeah, for
There's
sure.
our email address right there.
Yeah, and yeah, we've got the email address there. If you walk away and you're like, oh, I wish I'd asked that, or can I have more clarification of that, just send it through and we're happy to answer any questions that you've got. So shall we wrap then, if that's all the questions and we've communicated, we can give people back some time in their day to meditate upon plain language. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. We were actually a little bit overwhelmed with the interest in this topic, so I think it really does just validate how significant and important having the Plain Language Act is for us as a society in Aotearoa. As we've mentioned, if you do have questions, feel free to send them through afterwards. And we'll also be packaging up this video and the presentation deck and sending it through to you if you want to share it with others to be getting more awareness of the Act. Have you got anything you want to close with, Emma, before we log off?
No, I think you've covered it all. Just thank you everyone for your time today. We really appreciate it. Well.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have an amazing day.